Trees are real miracle workers if you stop to think about it. They are able to transform freely available solar energy into usable products like lumber, biomass, and of course, food, all while transforming carbon dioxide, a waste product of animal respiration, into oxygen, a valuable resource for us. And while most of our oxygen actually comes from ocean microplankton, land vegetation still play an important role in providing us with the air we breathe. One thing trees, and especially tropical forests like the Amazon, are responsible for is trapping excess carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, from the atmosphere to stabilize the climate. But I must say, of all the positive things trees provide for us, fruit is one of the most satisfying gifts. When I first got to this property, the first thing I did was to plant several fruit trees. A couple of years later, I was hoping to have a harvest, but I was seeing mixed results from the apples I had planted. This truly is a case of a tale of two apple trees. It's just remarkable the difference in growth from one side to the other. They were planted in the same time. They are obviously different varieties, and I don't remember if they had different rootstocks. And if you're not familiar with fruit trees in general, and you don't know about rootstocks, the growth of your tree will depend on what kind of stock it was grafted on. Usually, trees grow to standard size, but they can be grafted onto stock that's semi-dwarf or even dwarf. Dwarf trees will only grow up to 6 feet. I am not sure. I don't remember if that was a dwarf rootstock. If it was, that would explain it. Obviously, there are two different varieties, so comparing apples to oranges or apples to apples would be a bit difficult. Even though that's the case, I think there's another culprit that's causing this one to languish and that one to thrive, and it has to do with sunlight. This tree is casting shadows, and it wasn't this size when I planted this other tree. It's grown probably twice as much, and the arc of the sun doesn't hit this tree for as long as ideally. You want to increase that amount of sunlight the most that you can. So what I have to do is trim up or actually cut down this tree. I must confess, I don't celebrate cutting down trees. I would much rather be planting new ones, since we could use more of them in this industrialized world we live in. Having more trees around us not only helps to balance the world's climate by sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they provide us with immediate benefits for the here and now, not just the next generation. Even if we decide to ignore the lot we pass on to our collective children, having more trees around us will directly improve the air in our immediate neighborhoods, among other benefits like erosion and flood control. I say this from personal experience. Having grown up in one of the world's megacities, in São Paulo, Brazil, I've experienced firsthand how ignoring the environment around us can cause even direct short-term harm. Air quality in São Paulo is notoriously bad, although it was probably at its peak of worseness in the 90s, when I lived there as a child. Newer vehicle emission technologies and increased government regulation have helped taper off some of the pollution since, but I'm sure that if more trees grew in the city and green roofs were adopted, the situation could be better. While Brazil is home to one of the largest contiguous rainforests, the Amazon, around the urban centers and even in the countryside, there is a tendency to remove all trees around where you live. Of course, this is done for practical reasons, trying to utilize valuable urban or rural space efficiently, but having less trees around you will directly impact your health and well-being. Trees help purify the air. Growing up in São Paulo, smog meant I had trouble breathing. When I moved to Maryland, the air quality was substantially better, simply because there were a lot more trees around and environmental regulation were stricter to safeguard our health. Trees also prevent erosion and flooding. It is essential to have trees around the margins of rivers. In fact, Maryland used to have a lot less trees 100 years ago around cities. Conservation groups rallied to reestablish trees and create parks, and as a result, river valleys like the Patapsco were reforested to prevent erosion and silting from overworked farms. That being said, I am cutting or trimming down this tree because I need to give more energy to my apple trees. Captain Planet was my favorite cartoon, which sort of explains why I've always been a bit of an environmentalist. I'm also a bit pragmatic, therefore I think we need to come up with solutions and change our culture to value more the environment we live in. Planting more fruit trees and other edible crops around our unused suburban lots is part of the solution, not only to relieve some of our dependence on industrial culture, but to cultivate a love for nature in us. I've always liked that Mati, the Brazilian kid from Captain Planet, had the heart as his power. We must interact and tame nature around us because we become responsible for those we tame. The winds are starting to pick up, so it's time to stop and adjourn for the day. I'll finish it up some other day, but most of the work is done. At least what would actually be impeding the sunlight to reach the apples is gone. So it's just a matter of getting the trunk out. I'm sure that the apples will like it. They'll probably get 2 to 3 extra hours of sunlight in the morning, because that tree was covering, especially for the smaller apple tree, was covering the morning sun. And I do already have buildings to contend with, so I have to make the best I can with the little sunlight I have. Coming up in the next block, I will show you what I did with some of the branches right after this commercial. If you're loving the video and would like to help me produce more, you can purchase an original painting from my Etsy shop or support me through Patreon. Your direct support is the reason why I have been able to produce 2 episodes a week during the spring, so thank you. After I cut down the tree that was shading my apple trees, I had a lot of branches to deal with, but instead of treating them as trash, I wanted to have them be useful. I discovered that the tree I cut was an elm tree, and elms have a very pliable and strong bark that can be useful to create things. I thought about making my own garden string from bark that is traditionally called cordage. Nowadays, if we need string, we don't give it 2 thoughts. We just go for a ball of yarn or sisal twine, use it, and once we're done, we throw it away. That wasn't always the case. Making string or making rope or cordage was something that was time consuming, and it was essential for daily life. I will need string this year, as I usually do, to tie up tomatoes or other plants. But this time, instead of just going to the home improvement store, I'm gonna try to make my own with materials I have here. At least, let's try to experiment a bit. As I was cutting down, or actually trimming up, this elm tree behind me, I noticed that the inner bark of this type of species is perfect to do some kind of a twine or cordage. That's because it's very pliable and at the same time super strong, but it also separates easily from the bark, so it's ideal material, ideal fiber. So all I have to do is using a sharp instrument maybe to start peeling it. I then just have to peel it as if I were peeling a banana. That's it. Beautiful material. I must admit that it is rather satisfying to debark these branches. One important thing to note is that this bark comes off easier when the branch is still freshly cut. You can still do that even a few weeks after cutting them, but by then it becomes more difficult. Once you have your raw material, then all you need to do is prep it. This may be a bit of a boring stage, but it's kind of important. You need to try to get more of the inner bark instead of the outer bark, because that's the real good part. So you can try to use, perhaps using a small paring knife would be more effective in this case. But you can see that the outer bark kind of flakes away, especially on the older twigs, and then you're able to get this very fibery inner bark. And the goal is to get large or long lengths of thinner material that you could twist it. This is going to be the base, the foundation of your rope or your cordage. We do take for granted string and rope today because industry has given us an abundance of machine-made and synthetic options that are relatively cheap. I won't argue that they are superior in quality and function, but at least all the synthetic options have a deep flaw. They don't biodegrade, becoming garbage for centuries after being created. This handmade string would be great to use in the garden, since it would be sure to eventually break down and become soil again. After you prepared your material, the next step is to twist it. For that, you're going to need a nail and somewhere where you can nail it into. The nail will help you secure the string in place. This is especially important if you're doing this alone. Somebody else could hold it in place for you, but this is more convenient. You then start spinning. You have to choose either to do it clockwise or counterclockwise. Whatever you do, it always has to be the same direction. This is going to be the one ply. Of course, the bigger or the longer you're able to prepare your source material, the easier it's going to be later on. Just remember, if you want a more consistent, stronger cord to keep things sort of within the same scale in terms of thickness when you're choosing your material, then you can add new material also by twisting. So you put a new piece and you make it longer and you keep twisting and twisting and twisting. Because bark is a vegetable fiber, it will be harder to have a grip onto the other end you are attaching it to. You could do a small knot if your material is pliable enough, since this cordage will be rougher than regular string. Usually when you're spinning fiber, you don't want little knots, but this is not fine fabric, just rough garden string to hold tomatoes. Now, it is interesting to know that just 250 years ago, all fabric was woven from hand-spun string in this way, until a mechanized spinning wheel was invented. It sure was a lot of tedious and repetitive work. It just started to rain here, and while I wait for this rain cloud to pass, I'll just ravel this into a spool, ready for the next step, because this is only one ply. You don't want your twine to be just one ply because that's not strong enough. You need at least 2 ply. So I'll need twice as much, but I already have that. I suspect before the invention of radio, television, and the internet to watch YouTube videos during winter and rainy days, people had to resort to indoor activities to pass time. Since most of the population could not read or even afford to have a book, manual craft were what helped people keep their sanity during the long winter months. Of course, they didn't do this as a hobby, as we have the privilege to do so today. They depended on spinning their own string and rope and weaving their own cloth to survive. While I certainly don't need to do this, I like the process, and I like knowing that this piece of string came from my own backyard, from a 100% renewable resource, a tree, that gives us many gifts if only we are creative enough to learn how to use them. Once you have 2 strands of 1 ply, you can twist them together to form a strong, durable string. So this is the finished result. It's a very strong 2-ply cording or twine. I think it's going to work really well to hold up the tomatoes. And even though it did take a long time to do, one thing is for sure, I will value it more and use it sparingly. We only value the things we become responsible for because we've tamed them.